So what we'll do is, of course, jump straight into it, really. I know some of you are familiar with me or with some of my workshops you've been before, which I appreciate. But for those of you that don't know me or need a reminder of who I am, so I'm Myra Khan. I'm an accredited counsellor and supervisor and trainer. Recently published the book Working Within Diversity, which of course is the basis of all of my trainings, and particularly today's training, which is of course around then power, privilege and oppression. For me, not just this workshop, but in thinking about anti-oppressive practice, I'm passionate about it. It's what I've been teaching in various guises over the past, I would say, kind of 8 or 9 years. I should put that in context that I've been working as a counsellor with clients for 14 years. This month, I'm celebrating 14 years of working with clients, which feels like I genuinely don't know where that time has gone. So for me, I've kind of lived and breathed working with clients, working within diversity for 14 years. And for me, it really then culminated, of course, in the book. But for me, it really shows through then all of these different trainings that I offer. And for me, hopefully, my intention is that the book and all of my trainings are invitational spaces for practitioners to engage in thinking about these concepts. As I said a moment ago, what I really hope today's space is going to offer each of you and offer us together is a space in which we can think through and think about these concepts in dialogue. I really hope that all of you feel that you're able to really, I talk about, and I'll mention this word probably throughout the day, kind of deconstruct a lot of these concepts, because I think we hear them a lot of the time, but we don't always know what they actually mean. So I'm hoping that today offers you a deconstruction of what we actually understand by power, these terms, power and privilege and oppression, to then, in a way, reconstruct them so that we are then proactively and consciously and intentionally working with them in our clinical practice. And of course, everything that we think about today, if you are able to apply them to your clinical practice in our reflection spaces, if you're able to connect it to a particular client, then that's great. And if you are, and again, it's an invitation that if you want to then share that with the group, then please do feel free to do that. Okay. What I'm thinking then is, should we just have a quick whiz round the group, and I'm going to invite each of you to introduce yourself. It can very simply be, always the awkward moments in groups, isn't it? But very simply to say your name, and if you want to say any more about perhaps where you're located or the context of your clinical practice, please do. But as I said, it's invitational if you want to share any more than your name. Okay. And how I often do this is I'll nominate somebody to go first. And then if you want to then introduce yourself and then you nominate the next person, it saves the awkwardness of silence for a minute, but it then also avoids the 10 people trying to speak at the same time as well. So I'm going to invite, because she's right, I should ask for pronouns as well, so my apologies. But I will invite Jade to go first, as you are right next to me on my screen.
Hi, I'm Jade. It's good to be here again. I did the cultural attunement workshop, which was absolutely fantastic. So I've been really looking forward to today. I'm based in Hertfordshire, and I'm on my second year of my diploma in therapeutic counselling. And the orientation I am practicing in is person-centered. And I suppose, I'm just very aware of kind of how power, privilege and oppression plays out in all of our lives, and really just to gain more of an insight into the kind of the dynamics inherent within the therapeutic relationship as well, and how we can work with that and manage that, I suppose. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Jade. Welcome back. Would you like to nominate somebody to go next, please?
I'm going to nominate Nyla, because I recognise your face from last time.
Yeah, I also attended the cultural attunement workshop last time and it was so good. So yeah, I'm Nyla, she or they pronouns is fine. I'm in my first year of my training as a training counselling psychologist, and I work in person-centered practice at the moment. And I will nominate Deborah to go next.
Hi, I'm Deb. I'm the Chief Exec at Quetzal, which is a charity that provides counselling and support to female survivors of childhood sexual abuse. I'm not a counsellor. I've done no counselling training. So I think this is going to be, I'm kind of coming at this from a bit of a different perspective. But I'm hoping that I can learn about ways to improve our service and what I can feed in at a strategic level to hopefully kind of bring all this into the practice and work with Shabnam, who will introduce herself because I'm going to nominate her.
Thanks. I work with Des. I'm the clinical lead at Quetzal. I'm also a psychotherapist in practice for 10 years, and I also work with Corinne as a counselling lecturer at Tresham as well. So it's me in a nutshell. So I'm going to now pass you on to Corinne.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Corinne. Yeah, I'm a counsellor. I've been counselling a long time. Yeah, and I'm also a tutor as well. So yeah.
Lovely, thank you everybody. Oh, well, it feels really nice that people are already connected, whether that's through previous training with me or via your own kind of organisation. So that's lovely. So welcome everybody, and it's lovely to meet you all if I'm new to meeting you today. So thinking about power, privilege, and oppression, and Debs, in what you'd said as well, that absolutely, the moment we start recognizing that it's kind of present in clinical practice, we absolutely need to understand it at that organizational level as well. A little tangent here, but you might also, I'm sure you will already have heard of this, but there was the launch of the toolkit last week, the week before, of race and ethnicity training. It's a free toolkit to access on via the, I'll put a link in the chat in the break, but they're delivering kind of the trainers on the toolkit, if that makes sense. And it's aimed specifically at either counselling tutors or trainers that deliver counselling training, and also organisation services and institutions that deliver training. But because kind of, Debs, you're kind of talking about that kind of institutional structural level, it just pops into my head that might also be of interest to you. So so as I said, the toolkit is free to download. It's a PDF that came out 2 weeks ago, and the trainer is, I should know this because I'm training it. It's November, in a couple of weeks, Tuesday, let me look at my diary, Tuesday the 21st of November, and it comes up on the technically it's a BACP event, but it's free and it's open to anybody, BACP or non-BACP members.
Oh, amazing.
Again, I will put links up in the chat during the break. Please remind me, people, if I do forget, because my ADHD brain likes to have 20 tabs open in my brain and I forget the very first one that I've opened. I'm on the 20th. So absolutely, this stuff, the things we're going to be thinking about today, whilst we're going to be focusing on their application to clinical or therapeutic practice, when we zoom out, they are absolutely present in counselling services, the hierarchies within them and our processes, and then more broadly within the counselling profession and in counselling training organisations as well. Because of course, I say this so much, and again, apologies to those of you that have been on training with me before, but this notion that counselling exists in a vacuum is such a myth. The idea that we supposedly, and this is kind of oppressive, this idea that we as the counsellor can create a safe space that is separate from and disconnected from the rest of the out there world, I think is a complete misnomer. So for me, everything that happens within our profession, as I said, from kind of professional body level, like membership body level, through to trainings and institutions, through to counselling services, and then ultimately through to what we do in the room as counsellors and clients, it's all of that sits within this external context of structural and systemic inequality. And that's what we're going to be looking at today in terms of power, privilege, and oppression. So I often use this metaphor of, on the one hand, it's a telescopic lens in the sense that we look at this big picture and we look at this kind of structural systemic inequalities, and then we zoom in like a microscope into, okay, so how does that then show up in the counselling room? So that's kind of the two lenses that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be zooming out this big picture thinking, and we're going to think a little bit about that in the morning session, or the first session this morning. And then the rest of the day, we're kind of going to take that model and zoom into what it then means in the counselling room. Okay. So to get started, I'm going to do a slide share. What I should say is that I appreciate that when we slide share, we can't, you can set your screen to also see everybody at the side alongside the screen share. But what I will do is, after I've presented a few slides, and when we get to a natural point in the slides, when I've explained something, I will bring us back to gallery view as well, okay, so that we can then discuss and think about it together. Okay, so let me just bring up the slide deck for you. As I said, this is going to be shared with you throughout the day. Throughout the day, it's going to be shared with you on Monday, but of course we'll be sharing it throughout the day. And what else did I want to say about that? And if at any point you want to unmute and ask a question, or make a reflection, please do unmute and jump in. Okay, I've got my screen set so that I'm slide sharing, and at the same time I have a gallery view as well, so I can also see all of you. So if you put your hand up or if you unmute, I will spot that. Okay, so you are all visible to me, so please don't feel like you're now disconnected from the slide deck. I can see you still as well. What was the other thing I was going to say? Just something about, that was it. Yes, of course. With the fact that you're obviously going to get the slide deck is going to be shared with you on Monday. So in that respect, then you don't need to worry about capturing all the information on the slides. But of course, I absolutely invite you to write down your notes and reflections throughout the day, because actually that's the stuff that I think really stays with us when we're in training. The actual content and what's on the slides you'll get anyway. So for me, I really do encourage and invite you to really be thinking about how this stuff applies to you personally and as a practitioner, and then in your clinical work. Okay, so teas and coffee breaks up there, of course, priorities. So that was the schedule I've just mentioned for the day. And then thinking about really, what we're going to be looking at today, really then thinking, as I said, kind of zoning in and really looking at these kind of societal and cultural dynamics of power, privilege and oppression. And then, of course, in thinking about how does it show up? What is it? What is its role and impact in the counselling process and therapeutic relationship? And most importantly, then how do we actually work with it? And how we then, based on that, actually work within diversity? Because once we understand power and privilege is present in counselling, we then have a choice to either ignore it and let it play out, or consciously and intentionally work in an anti-oppressive position or lens in order to, what I call, flatten the power. What I mean by flattening the power is not to get rid of the power, because we can't actually get rid of power, but what we can do is equalize it. So it's really at the end of the day, we will have kind of gone along with this journey together and got to a point at the end of the day of thinking about how do we then equalize power in our relationships. So that's kind of an overview really of what the outline of the day is going to look like. Okay. What I'm going to do in this first session, or the first session before the first break, is to do a quick overview, as I said, that kind of bigger lens thinking of moving in thinking about where does power and privilege currently locate itself within practice, and how and why are we moving into this anti-oppressive position? Because as I just said, if we are coming from the starting point that power and privilege is present, then it's about understanding, okay, so how does it show up, and how is it, and how do we then work with it? So for me, if we are accepting and acknowledging that power and privilege is present, it means then that we are intentionally moving from an oppressive position that doesn't acknowledge power and privilege, and we are moving to an anti-oppressive position, because an anti-oppressive position acknowledges power and privilege. Like, you can't have one without the other. We can't say, oh, I want to be an anti-oppressive practitioner, but I'm not even going to acknowledge power and privilege, because power and privilege and oppressive practice, or oppressive behaviours rather, is what makes something oppressive. And only by working with power, privilege and oppression dynamics are we then intentionally being anti-oppressive. So obviously for me then the two go hand in hand. So for me, my work is about us intentionally moving from working with diversity, which is an oppressive position, to working within diversity, which is to take up this anti-oppressive position. So that's going to be really the shift we're making today in thinking about power and privilege. Now, for those of you that have been to previous trainings, we did that through thinking about cultural attunement. So thinking about power, privilege and oppression is another component of how we move from oppressive to anti-oppressive practice. So cultural attunement is one way of doing it, or one of the components of anti-oppressive practice. Power, privilege and oppression is another component to anti-oppressive practice. So for me, it's not one or the other, it's we do both, plus others. But today we're specifically focusing on the component of power. So moving from an oppressive to anti-oppressive practice. And this next slide really highlights why power and privilege, or thinking about power dynamics, is at the heart of anti-oppressive practice. Like I said, you can't do one without the other. It's because, excuse me, it's because anti-oppressive practice explicitly acknowledges structural and systemic inequalities. And so by doing that, we are looking at the entire power oppressive relational dynamic. And in this morning session and before lunch, we will be looking at this, of course, in more detail. Anti-oppressive practice then supports how an understanding of how each person is shaped by their lived experiences and by these underlying systemic and structural the underlying systemic and structural context. Again, there's something here for me which is about, it's not only looking at a minoritized end or an oppressed end of the spectrum. For me, it's about looking at the entire power oppressive spectrum and spectrums of oppression that we will be looking at today, and recognizing that at any given point we can land anywhere on, we can land on either end of this spectrum. And so anti-oppressive practice, we're supporting this understanding of how each person is shaped by their lived experience, by this underlying systemic and structural context, and then which end of this system of oppression we land on and experience at any given moment. Anti-oppressive practice also supports this offer. And I kind of talk about both this offer, approach and facilitation of a relational dynamic of equality, and to flatten, as I mentioned earlier, to equalize the power oppression hierarchy in our practice, processes and relationships. Again, for me, it's about being very intentional, that it's not just about us cognitively or competently understanding, like a cognitive process of understanding systems of oppression, or a knowledge-based understanding of power practices or power dynamics. For me, it's about, that's just the first step. This is about, once we recognize those things are at play, how do we then actually work with them? So how are we offering to facilitate and offer a relational dynamic and a relationship of equality? And how do we then intentionally and proactively equalize or flatten that power hierarchy? So it's not just a knowledge, cognitive, competence-based approach, it's a in practice approach as well. Anti-oppressive practice also identifies the out there context. Again, this is about recognizing that the profession and our practice does not exist in a vacuum. And as practitioners, and us as clients and our clients, we each have our own lived experience of privilege and or oppression. So again, it's not a binary approach, and equally, it's not a mutually exclusive approach. Each and every one of us, and we'll get into this in a bit more depth today, each and every one of us will have experiences of privilege, and we will also have our own individual experiences of oppression as well. And so it's to recognize that when we are in the room, with our clients and in therapeutic relationship, we are shaped by and we carry within us our lived experiences of privilege and oppression. We don't somehow leave our lived experience, or this misnomer or myth that, oh, I leave my baggage at the door, or I leave my identity at the door. For me, there's no such thing. It's all there in the room. We hold all of that constantly. And then finally, anti-oppressive practice. Because we are acknowledging the structural inequalities out there, we are then acknowledging that there are structural inequalities in here. And so we are then working to flatten that power, equalize that power. And again, at every layer of kind of the hierarchy of the profession. So whether that's between counsellors and clients, whether that's between counselling tutors or students, or whether that's between supervisor and supervisee, in all of these relationships and processes, we are offering a dynamic which holds the client, student or supervisee then in equal regard to the practitioner or tutor, without the client, student or supervisee being marginalised, minoritised or other by the service, institution, practice or tutor. So, and I think this actually holds really important resonance today for the fact that within our group today, we have got practitioners and service managers. So I'm thinking specifically for Deb, is it Debs or Debbie? Debs, wasn't it? You introduced yourself as Debs. It's not just as a counsellor, it's as a service manager, as an institution. It's to offer an experience, a service that equalises the power between those within the service and the clients or the service users accessing that service as well. And so for me, anti-oppressive practice, for me, it must be applied to every level of our work. Okay, what I'm going to do is just stop the share and bring it back to the gallery. And I'm just going to invite people a minute maybe to jot down any notes that they might, or reflections they might have. And then equally just open up the space just for a few minutes, just to capture anybody's thoughts, reflections or questions. And then we're going to move into thinking more specifically about power. So just give yourselves a minute to capture any reflections or thoughts. Please do also capture any questions that might come to mind as well, because of course this is an opportunity for us to think about and not only think about those questions and of course think about the answers to them, but also this really is an opportunity for all of us together to, as I said, to kind of get better understanding of what these concepts are as well. So no such thing as a stupid question. This is an opportunity for each of you to get what you need today.
I didn't have a question.
Corinne, please, yes.
I didn't have a question, but I find it really bizarre that people think that counselling could be separate. I find that really strange, because my experience has always been that whatever goes on politically walks straight into the counselling room. You know, like my experience of Brexit was I saw a lot of people that were really affected by that because they had a partner or they themselves were going through, what on earth happens to me? What's going to happen to our family? And similarly with LGBT plus, you know, when some of those things are being said, that's come straight in with some of the children, young people that I've worked with. You know, what does that mean for me? So I find it really bizarre that people would separate and not link it up, you know.
Yeah.
That's just my reflection. So
yeah. And I think this, if me personally, my experience has been, I completely agree with you that of course the two, you can't separate them, but I think where that's been born out of, though, this separation, this fracture between what happens in the counselling room and the rest of the world, I think is born out of very Western models of individuality, and almost like, I want to say, a preciousness of, oh, what goes on between me and my client in this room is something that's precious and exclusive just for me and them, and it's only about what's going on with them internally. Because of course it's born out of, because I'm psychodynamic, I'm of course going right back into Freud, and I'm thinking about where has it been born out of, which is something about internal chaos. But of course, we not that we only know it now, but of course we can recognize now that internal chaos is born out of external. It's what we've internalized, and what's going on out there, what externally is manifesting and impacting on our internal. But it's born out of this idea that the two are separate. And unfortunately, there are still counsellors out there who are going to think that the two are separate. People still argue that therapy is not political, and there's no space for social justice. I'm like, So I wonder how you make sense of them while your clients are in distress, which is worrying. Yeah, but yeah. Thank you, Corinne. Yeah. And anybody else, any other thoughts, reflections, or questions at this stage? It's an invitation. If you don't, that's absolutely fine. Okay. So what we'll move on to then is, in my metaphor of telescope to microscope, we're going to stay at this telescope level just for the next section, because what I want to do then is just walk us through the working within diversity model in order to know where power then kind of belongs within it. If you're anything like me, I use a lot of metaphor in my teaching, as some of you know from previous workshops. My mind works in the sense of, I need to know the context of something in order to know where I fit it into that bigger picture. I kind of use the map metaphor for this. It's a bit like, I'm based in Leicester, so I'm a bit like, well, I don't know, I cannot figure out where Leicester is on a map, like when I was little, unless I saw the whole map, if that makes sense. Like, I need to know the whole map to know where something is located within it. And so the working within diversity model, as I walk through it, is for the purpose of being able to locate the concept of power, or the component of power within it. And then we're going to focus on that one component. Okay. So if you're wondering why I'm setting this bigger scene first, it's for that reason. I hope it's useful so that people know where it fits in my thinking anyway. So I'm going to go back to screen share. So for working within diversity model, I've just skipped past that previous slide intentionally, because we're going to come back to it afterwards. Okay, so working within diversity. So for me, it's this move from working with diversity to working within diversity. So with working within diversity, we start with the premise that we have a counsellor and client in the room, as we would with working with diversity. However, with working within diversity, we are in a two-way relationship between counsellor and client, that we are both present in the room as whole people, and that we both hold our own identity. So there are then two people in the room, therefore two identities in therapeutic relationship with each other. Okay. This compares to working with diversity that would locate identity just with the client, and therefore labels the client as diverse and different from the counsellor. Okay, so we're moving away from the idea that the client is diverse or different, and therefore the counsellor is normative, centred and neutral in their identity. But instead, we are recognising that it's actually two identities in the room and in therapeutic relationship with each other. Based on this premise then, that there are two identities in the room, neither person is different or diverse from the other, but rather we are both located within a context of diversity. So diversity no longer is labelled with as person, but it is the context in which we belong. And I often think about the swimming pool metaphor whenever I think of this slide, because I kind of think about diversity being the swimming pool and we both exist within it. Rather than my client is diverse or different from me, and that would be the equivalent of, I often think of those blue English heritage plaques whenever I think of working with diversity, because it's the equivalent of saying diversity lives here with the client. And so rather than diversity being an identity with the client, diversity becomes a framework or a concept in which we both belong. And it removes diversity as a label, okay? So we are working within diversity. We are working within this swimming pool of diversity. As a premise, or as the foundation block for my model, once we understand that we are two identities in therapeutic relationship, we then can put this swimming pool within its wider context. And this is where we move into the model as a whole. So taking that swimming pool, which is that inner rectangle, that lighter grey rectangle, we can then place that entire swimming pool within this external context, within the external context of counselling and then of the broader out there world, external world. And so what we then create is this very structured framework of understanding diversity within its rightful context. So the moment we then think about anti-oppressive practice or working within diversity, we can identify then that everything we do in the room, in this inner lighter grey rectangle, takes place within this first component, which is this structural and systemic context of counselling. Now that's going to be the profession, training, the services that we work within or agencies we work in. It can include private practice, and within the wider social context of the out there. So everything that takes place within our work takes place within this external context. So that's component one of the model. Component two of the model then is, once we then get into a relationship with a client, or with between tutor and student, or between supervisor and supervisee, we are in a two-way relationship, and both counsellor and client hold identity and intersectionality. So component two of the model is specifically looking at identity. Okay, and this is where we take it away from this really moves us away from working with diversity to working within diversity. So component two of the model focuses specifically on identity. Component three, then, this is where we start to look at what's going on between us and how is power showing up and what is the impact of power. And that, of course, includes privilege and oppression. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Okay. And then the fourth component of the model is, again, in being in relationship between counsellor and client, student tutor, or supervisor supervisee, what is going on within our relationship between us because of identity, because of power, because of structural systemic contexts and the process. So what is happening in our relationships because of these other four components? And then finally, component number 5, therapeutic process. What is going on in our relationships? What is going on in the space between us? Again, because of the other components. So it's not a case of these are mutually exclusive and only one of these exists at one time, but it is about all 5 of these components exist simultaneously. They are all present. And for me, what this model does, it allows me to be reminded of and to be mindful of what is happening at each of these components, what's happening at all of these levels. And so all of them exist at the same time, and they all interact with one another. You know, what's happening in the power between us, what power balance or imbalance is happening, and why? Is it because of something in the identity? Is it being played out in the relationship? Is there something showing up in the process maybe that's indicative that power games or power dynamics are being played out? So it's not just about going, right, now tick the box, I've been trained on power. It's about how do they all interact as well. Okay, so this is why I put it into this broader model of working within diversity. Okay. And of course, today then, we're specifically going to be kind of deep diving then into the power component. Okay. Let me just, what I'll do is I'm going to keep the model up there for a moment. I'm going to invite everybody again just to take a moment to make any notes or reflections or questions. And then we'll bring it back to the room. Okay. So just give yourselves a moment just to capture any thoughts or maybe feelings about it, thoughts, reflections, or questions.
I think this is a really interesting but also
Yeah.
instinctive way of looking at it. But from my experience working with counselors and working with students, it's almost when they think of power, it becomes between counsel and client, doesn't it? But actually, it's within the systemic context. It's that whole institutional.
Yes.
And when we've had conversations with people sort of from different cultural backgrounds, it's that comes up rather than actually the understanding between the client and the counsellor. But I think that part sometimes is missed, because when some counsellors sort of look at it, they look at it from, oh, but you know, I'm working really, really hard here to flatten what's happening between us. But actually, sometimes it's not just us. It's what's being fed from outside as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Again, we cannot exclude the impact of the out there.
No.
On the in here. Yeah.
No, you can't. And, you know, I think from like some people that I'm thinking of, generational trauma as well. Actually, that comes down because it's part of their identity.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Again, what we'll absolutely kind of explore as we've started to this morning already is recognizing that what shows up in the room is not only because of the two people in the room. It's because of this structural and systemic context. It's about what's being replayed and repeated in here. But if we go back to the previous reflections about people believing that what happens in here is separate, we can start to quite easily blame the client maybe, or the individual, for why that power is, or why that particular power dynamic is showing up. And the client gets kind of an individual blame for it, as opposed to, maybe this is reflective of what's actually going on out there. Maybe this is reflective of a broader structural systemic context. Yeah. And again, it's not binary. It's not one or the other. They're not mutually exclusive. It can be a combination of both. You know, sometimes it is because it's the individual client doing something, but it can also be a client unconsciously recreating something from out there.
Or what they're living out there, because we're only like one drop really of a moment in their life, but it's everything else that's happening out there that keeps feeding into what's happening between us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. What I'm going to do is I'll just stop sharing so that we can come back to the group, and I'm going to invite anybody else that wants to kind of jump in as well. Please do unmute. Any other thoughts or reflections on maybe the model, or thinking about, as Shubnam said, the position maybe that we put power in within our practice or trainings? Or how does it feel perhaps to put it in this new context? Corinne, yeah.
I was just thinking about sort of my experiences, that often it is that somebody's been traumatized by, you know, their experience. And actually, sometimes I think that's what you're dealing with as well, is the trauma of, you know, the systemic system. And that's what I was thinking about. It's really difficult. It's quite heavy.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about the moment in my head. I'm thinking, I don't know why I'm thinking of two different pools, maybe because I talk about the swimming pool metaphor, but almost a bit like if we were to put the individual, yeah, let's go with this in my head anyway. If we go with the idea that if we think about it, if we go with that idea that a client is traumatized and we go, they're being traumatized because of their own individual experience and because of what they're going through, in a way, we're kind of putting them in a paddling pool and we're going, well, client, you are experiencing, I don't know, let's say bullying at work or something, for example. Well, you're experiencing that bullying. Well, let's think about your relationships. Let's think about, well, what's going on in these relationships? And what we might do if we didn't acknowledge that there might be structural systemic context to that bullying, we are going to be looking as if the individual is both responsible for their suffering, their trauma, and also individually responsible to fix it and to make it better, repair it. Yeah. Whereas the moment you kind of take them in their paddling pool and put them within this swimming pool and go, actually, the paddling pool exists within this broader systemic structural context. Oh, now all of a sudden now it stops being you in isolation, individual on your own in your suffering. And you are not experiencing this because of you personally, if that makes sense. But might it be because of something that you represent or where you land on this spectrum of oppression? And therefore you become, I was going to say like a conduit for it, but you become the object for that oppression to be put into or to experience. You're on the receiving end of oppressive practice or bullying, which is an oppressive practice or action, because of who you represent, as opposed to if you just in your paddling pool, well, you're being bullied because of who you are. It becomes a shaming experience. It becomes something about there's something wrong with you. You're broken or you're faulty. And so you're experiencing something because of who you are as an individual, rather than you're experiencing something because you're an individual within this broader context. And within this broader context, you are at the minoritized end of the spectrum. Yeah. So I think it's so important that whatever narrative, whatever experience the client is bringing, it's to think about, am I unconsciously and intentionally placing them in a paddling pool? And have I thought about putting that paddling pool then within this swimming pool? Yeah. But that's it. And I think that's where I think then a lot of clients then feel like they are to blame, that they are not good enough, that they are broken, that they are at fault or they are faulty, and therefore they are suffering in the way that they're doing because of who they are, like individually, internally, as opposed to actually, no, I experience this because I'm located at this oppressed end of the spectrum because I represent belonging to a minoritized community. Yeah, you can almost feel the shift in the feeling, can't you? Going, it's not me individually, it's because I get located at this end of the spectrum. Yeah. Any other thoughts or reflections? Or equally any thoughts of what, Shubnam or Corinne have said as well, please do feel free to pick up any of those threads if you want to.
I think sometimes it's difficult when the client recognizes what you've just said. And then the frustration sometimes to be able to get that across as well, because because if the client is there, that this is happening because this is, I represent a minoritized version or a minority, but then the people around them, and I think and the people around them may not have gotten to where they've gotten to, and I am thinking of students here, to be fair, just to put it in context, they have not gotten to where the individual has gotten to. That can be quite frustrating, I think, to be able to communicate that across, because everyone else is still in the paddling pool.
Yes.
But what they've done in their mind is taken it and put it into the swimming pool, but everyone else is still thinking like they're in. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I think it's interesting because, again, it goes back to the conversation we were having right at the beginning, that for a lot of therapists, based on depending on what training they had, they've been trained that clients only exist in their paddling pool. And so for any of us to go, oh, let me put my client and these metaphorical paddling pools into this swimming pool, that it fundamentally pivots and shifts how we then work moving forward. And I always congratulate any practitioner that comes to my trainings, because you are intentionally making a shift in challenging the status quo of training and of the profession, because you're daring to challenge the narrative that we've been given, that it's clients each individually in their own paddling pool, and to say, actually, no, it's because of structural systemic contexts and power dynamics. It's a big shift in, as I said, it's challenging the status quo, it's challenging what I think traditional counselling is based upon, for that very reason. And I think we each get there in our own time. And so, yeah, sometimes you might feel like, oh, I'm the only one that's made that shift and other people have yet to get there. But equally, I'm mindful that not everybody's had the opportunity to be aware of this. Not every practitioner's had the opportunity to learn about the swimming pool effectively. If all they know is that paddling pools exist, the discovery of swimming pool is it can be quite mind-blowing. So, I applaud you all for coming on this training and being open to discovering what's beyond the paddling pool.
Totally using that analogy going forward. So I'm just telling you that I'm going to take it.
Oh, please. Do you know what? I feel like I teach metaphors and I check out metaphors all the time. So whatever resonates, whatever helps you to make sense of this, please do use them. I mean, that's how my brain works. I can minimize my training down to like a handful of metaphors and go, yep, got it. So whatever resonates, whatever helps you to make sense of this, please do use them. I would much rather you take a metaphor and go, I know what, I can understand it and I can use it and I can apply it, than going, well, how do I put that in kind of longhand effectively? No, so please do take whatever works for you today. So yeah. So this idea then that we're going to kind of be focusing specifically then on the power within this, but of course it doesn't then exclude the other components. It just holds those in mind loosely in the background when we think then about power, because of course then it will show up in these other, we have to take two things. We have to take these other components in mind that influence power, and it's a two-way process. These other components will influence the power, and power will influence the other components. So power is going to show up in the process. Power is going to show up in the relationship, but also the other way around. Because we're in a relationship, it's going to trigger an experience of power. So again, they're not binary and they're not all one way. These are 5 components, a bit like a neural network. They're 5 neurons or synapses in a neural network that are all talking to each other backwards and forwards, speaking to each other all the time. And so what's actually going on then between us in our therapeutic relationships then, or in our supervision relationships, or in a training, or within a service, all of these 5 components in any given moment are all active. Yeah, they're all talking to each other backwards and forwards all the time. Okay. So moving specifically then onto thinking about power and privilege, what I'm going to do is pop you into a couple of discussion groups, but what I'm going to do is show you this. I'm going to show you the question first, get my words out. I'm going to ask you then to think about, there we go. What do we actually understand by power and privilege? So the words, the actual, the word itself, or the definition, or the concept of them. Okay, so what do you understand by the concept or definition of power and of the concept of privilege? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. I'll pop you into a couple of breakout rooms just to get you talking to each other. What I will also do is I'll pop the question into the chat as well, so you have it there as well. So let me just so obviously 2 of you in one group and 3 in another. and if both groups can discuss both, so both groups thinking about what do you understand by the concept or component of power, what do you understand by the concept or yeah, the concept of privilege. Okay, I'm going to open the rooms now. I'm only going to give you a few minutes to do this, 5 maximum. Okay, welcome back everybody. So whoever wants to kind of feedback based on what their group were talking about, what was your understanding, or all the groups or individually your understanding of the concept or definition of power or privilege? Where did you get to in your thinking on it? Don't expect you to come back with definitions or here is a fully fledged, fully understood understanding of it, but just kind of what were the things that you were kind of discussing in your groups?
For me, I was saying I see privilege as like your way of being in the world is like centered and is seen as like the norm. And it can often be invisible if you occupy that position.
Yes, yeah, that they're hidden. A lot of privilege is hidden because quite rightly, yeah, you say it's absolutely as you said, Nida, it's about the position then of being normative or centered. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I think I use the word unspoken as well, because I feel like sometimes it's just assumed, you know, there's an assumption that's made.
Yes, yeah. So something here about privilege then being in the position, you can get placed in that position because it's assumed, and or if you do occupy that position, then it becomes hidden or normative for that person. Yeah. Really good kind of words here to think about. Yeah, privilege. Yeah. Anybody else?
About privilege sort of being almost the chances that you've been given, in the sense of like a head start or things that are outside of your control, you know. So it could be like the socioeconomic status, or you know, the family that you've been born into, the culture you've been born into, and that's almost that it's given you like Debs, I don't want to sort of take over, but you gave a really great analogy of like being a straight road and then a curved sort of a winding road with did you say a backpack of stones?
Yeah.
So we were looking at privilege in that sort of sense, because that's what immediately sort of came up for us. And then sort of the power side, we were looking at sort of in relationships, the control and that hierarchy. You know, there's an imbalance of power, and those were like, it's a loaded word really, because quite a lot was coming up in the sense of, you know, yes, you can look at empowerment, which is quite a positive thing, but actually immediately it was the imbalance of power, it was the control, it was the abuse of power, that and those kinds of sort of ideas that were coming up.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that there's a distinction in there when we think about power, the different types, because later on today we'll be looking at the different types of power. Because interestingly, power in and of itself is not automatically kind of good or bad, if that makes sense. And I will have a look at the actual definition of it in a moment. For me, it's about where power gets problematic is how it gets utilized, in what way it gets utilized. Power, yeah, it's like power in it. It's a bit like, let's think of a knife. A knife in and of itself is a knife. But how we might use that knife, of course, we know then that it can be used in very helpful, positive ways, but equally it can be used in very destructive ways as well. And so power for me is absolutely that. It's about we all have it. It's about how it gets wielded. And, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned that word empowerment, Shubnam. I'll be curious to know how you may change your view of it by the end of today. And the reason that's just popped into the only reason I'm having that thought is because empowerment for me it's not, again, in and of itself, not a positive thing. Empowerment, again, like power, is in and of itself is neutral. It's how it's being used, because the person doing the empowering of somebody else, or empowering of yourself, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, because empowering somebody, again, who's got the power, but if it's coming from within, then it's, then that's a different thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So again, using "I will empower you," that's just feels uncomfortable. And again, there's that hierarchy. And if somebody says, "I feel empowered," then that's worth exploring, like how and where did that come from? And is it coming from within?
It's so subtle, but it goes back to kind of, Nyla, what you were saying a moment ago when we came back from the breakout rooms, that it's so nuanced, because I think what we do is we associate positive or negativity to the word, and for a lot of people they see it as a positive thing. And so I hear lots of, unfortunately, I do hear kind of, not lots of counsellors, thankfully, but I do hear counsellors say things like, "I'm here to empower my clients," and I'm thinking, oh, that's not a good thing. If we're in a position to say that we are empowering somebody else, actually what we're doing is utilizing our power over them. It's still oppressive. We cannot actually empower anybody. We can facilitate somebody, or we can support somebody to utilize or access their own personal power, but we cannot actually give power to somebody.
I completely agree with all of that. I'm curious, what do you think about when people talk about things like, if we're to say, for example, as counsellors, we can disempower people? Is there like a similar kind of caveat to that?
Yeah, in opposition, I would say that it's an interesting one, because I was going to say we can disempower, but we're not actually, because disempower would be, are you using the word disempower to mean that we take power away from somebody?
Probably, yeah.
Which now that we can talk about it, because we can't do that, but what we can do, we can see, this is what I'm saying about, no, if we're talking about disempower being we take power away, we can't, just as we can't give power, but what we can do is we can oppress, so that we dismiss, minimize, or remove, not even remove, but we put their power to one side.
That's a much better way of putting it,
Yes. So we can, so what you're really talking about is we can't empower or disempower, but what we can do, we can either oppress or support.
Yeah, exactly.
We can either be anti-oppressive or oppressive.
Thank you.
Yeah. Again, really useful conversation to have here, because I think, again, we can fall into the trap of using language that actually, when we again, what's the word, deconstruct language that we use, we can start to see that actually that's not what I mean. And for me, language is so important when it comes to anti-oppressive practice, because if we don't challenge, question, or deconstruct the language that we use, we can be, and very often unconsciously and unintentionally, being and using oppressive language. So the idea, I can empower, oppressive. I can disempower, also oppressive. But I can oppress. I can offer and try and have intentions to be anti-oppressive, absolutely. So you can start to see the shift again that we're thinking about today. Yeah. So it's an interesting, some of these words that we think sound positive or helpful from the outside, such as empower, actually don't ignore, or disempower, both of them equally, don't actually acknowledge the power dynamic that's actually being played out underneath it. So as counsellors, we have to be so mindful of what we say we do in the room with our clients. So if counsellors are talking about, I empower my clients, or I support empowerment, again, it's about how we're using the word. I'm not saying don't use the word, but how are you positioning it in terms of, am I doing it to my client, or am I facilitating a process for them to engage in their own personal power, or access it, or to reclaim it? Yeah.
It feels like there's an agenda there, isn't there?
Mm.
It's like, if I remember somebody saying to me, I want to empower all women, so that, they can be independent and strong. And I'm like, but that's your thing.
Yes. Yeah.
That may not be what somebody else wants or needs right now.
Yes. Yeah.
So again, I think it comes back to those maybe hidden agendas that
Yeah.
people think they've got, some of the
Yeah.
stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're doing.
Yes. And also not really understanding what power then means. If we are going around saying that we can empower people, you've actually not understood what. I'd be very, 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 very wary then, because by somebody saying that, they don't actually understand what power then is. So if I was to engage with that person, I'll be like thinking, oh my goodness, what is it that you're actually wanting me then to do? Or how are you wanting me to be? Because if you think you can empower me, then you don't actually understand what my what power is, and B, what my power is. So it's, for me, it's so nuanced, but it's when we start to deconstruct it, we're like, oh gosh, this actually is how I'm having to think differently about this work. So absolutely, all these are very, very useful conversations and discussions to have. So what I'm going to do then is, just before we head into break, I'm going to share with you then the definitions, because again, interesting that, let me just do it as a slide deck. There we go. So power as an actual definition is the ability to influence and or act. This is so again, we're taking it right back to what actually is the concept of power. So really interesting that very often we place it as a negative. We place it as something that we either don't want to, almost a bit like we don't want to use it against other people, or it's bad to have power. Maybe for some people it's a good thing. I want to have power over people, maybe. But in and of itself, it's the ability to influence and or act in its core, original, true sense. And this is why I talk about the moment we can place it in this somewhat neutral definition, we can then start to see, a bit like a knife. A knife can cut, but it's how we yield it, it's how we utilize power, when we can then start to actually use it in a negative or positive, oppressive or anti-oppressive manner. Okay. So power in and of itself is the ability to influence and or act. Privilege then mean, and it's absolutely quite rightly, some of you have said as well, it's these unearned benefits that are given to members of one social group because of the systematic targeting or marginalization of another group. So only a dominant social group will have privilege. And these are benefits then that people don't, there are benefits that people don't earn, but just get because of who they are or are perceived to be. So again, going back to those keywords that some of you have used there, that they're hidden, that they are assumed, that they are just automatically given to people because you are seen as belonging to that dominant group. And therefore they're unearned. And as some of you have already quite rightly pointed out, that privilege then is not necessarily what you're given as a head start. It also includes, I love that metaphor of the straight road versus the windy road. So it's not that the straight road, you get a head start on the straight road, but the fact that there is a lack of barrier, a lack of hindrance, a lack of barriers or blocks, what's the word? Hurdles. So I always think of somebody running a 100-meter race versus 110-meter hurdles. That's the difference. So somebody who has privilege is running a 100-meter flat, and then the person running the 110-meter hurdles is expected to compete equally with the person doing the 100 flat. And somehow in society, we then expect both people to cross the line at the same time. That's the difference between privilege, between people that have privilege and people that don't. Okay. So, and because of that privilege, like I said, it's unearned. We automatically get, selected for the 100-meter flat. And not because I'm a better runner than the person who's going to run the hurdles. It's because I happen to belong to a dominant social group. And the person running the hurdles is identified and located and placed as a non-dominant group. Okay. And for each and every one of us, we will all experience privilege. We will all experience the 100-meter flat, dependent on which of our identity characteristics is dominant and in what situation and in what relationship dynamic. But each of us will also have experienced the 110-meter hurdles and have experienced oppression. So this is, again, not binary. It's not mutually exclusive. All of us in our lives will experience privilege in an experience or in a relationship at some point. We hold privilege in some areas of our life. Simultaneously, we also hold oppression or oppressive experiences. And so to add in here then, because we're thinking about all three today, the third definition I've added in there then is the definition of oppression. That being then the systematic targeting or marginalization of one social group by another social group for the benefit of the more powerful social group. So this is where privilege and oppression go hand in hand. In order to earn those benefits, in order to only ever run the 100-meter flat, in order to get ahead, in order to get what you want, you have to fracture and split off and target and marginalize another social group that you then position as of low social value and see them as less powerful than you. In order to hold power over, in order to hold and earn privilege, you need to simultaneously be oppressing another social group. So this is where we then talk about systems and spectrums of oppression and inequality, systemic and structural inequality. This is how it's created. It's created through oppression, and then that dominant group then gains all the spoils from it. They are always then on this 100-meter flat. So this is what we're talking about when we're thinking about how power might play up in the work. Obviously, we'll think about that in a lot more detail today, but also where it exists out there, how it's created out there in the world. And this is what is going on then, right now, politically, this is what's happening out in Israel and Gaza. We're living through a very real life experience of how this happens. And so you can't have one without the other. You can't have oppression unless power and privilege are there. And the moment that a group positions themselves as powerful and privileged, they can only do that because they're oppressing another group. Okay. And as I said, when we recognize that this is happening out there, because the in here then is not a vacuum, this is what we're looking at to go in that component 3 of the model. This is what we're saying, okay, so how on earth then is, because this is the context we have our lived experiences and out there, how is it then potentially showing up in here? Okay, and how might we be intentionally or unintentionally recreating a power dynamic, a privileged oppressive dynamic in the in here space? And that can be through the therapy, as I said, whether it's between counsellor and client, supervisor, supervisee, or client and student and tutor, but also in services. How are service users or clients accessing a service? How are they unintentionally engaging in an oppressive dynamic? What's making a person or an individual feel that they are running the 110-meter hurdles, trying to navigate your service or working with a counsellor? And then how are they feeling that in the relationship, in the therapeutic relationship? Okay. So this slide for me is kind of the core of then what we're recognizing exists out there, and how is it then getting experienced and recreated in here. Okay. I'm going to come back, stop sharing and come back to gallery. Again, just give yourselves a moment just to jot down any thoughts or capture any thoughts or reflections. I appreciate it. If it's throwing up more questions for you right now, then that's absolutely fine. Like it's meant, not that it's meant to, but it doesn't, it doesn't surprise me that it does. And that's okay, because that's the purpose of today. And I'm just going to invite space just for a couple of minutes if anybody does want to share any thoughts or reflections before we go into break. Or if there's anything that anybody's kind of sitting with in response to what we've thought about in this first section.
I'm a linguistic processor. I think, like, for me, perception was the key word. You know, sort of like, whose perception is it, and who influences that perception of these different social groups or society. I think that was something that I was thinking about.
Yes, yeah. And that's why I think language is so important. You know, it's so important that we are really mindful of what is it that we are communicating and what is it we're then setting up relationally and dynamically when we use the words that we're saying. You know, just based on the example we had a moment ago about the word empowerment or disempowerment, you know, it can subtly but also very explicitly shift a power dynamic if we are not careful. And if we're walking around as counsellors going, oh, I'm here to empower you, we've immediately placed our client in a very powerless position, and we are then holding a huge amount of power over them, even if we mean well, which of course hopefully we all do. But you can start to see how these can very subtly but very quickly set up inequalities in our work. Any other thoughts or reflections? No? Okay. Right, well, we'll go for our mid-morning break here.